The explosion rocked the compound as Sarah's bullet found its mark. The man carrying the explosive charges disappeared in a fireball that shattered windows and sent debris flying in all directions. The blast was larger than Sarah had anticipated, suggesting the charges were more powerful than standard demolition explosives. Immediately, the compound erupted into chaos. Men shouted in multiple languages as they scrambled for cover and tried to understand what had happened. Some dove behind walls while others ran toward the vehicles, only to discover their dead comrades and realize they were stranded. Sarah was already moving to her secondary position when the return fire began. Bullets whistled through the air where she had been lying just seconds earlier. The cleanup crew had located her muzzle flash and was directing concentrated fire at her previous location. From her new position 30 meters away, Sarah could see the damage her shot had caused. The explosion had torn a hole in the compound's main wall and started a fire in the ground floor. More importantly, it had disrupted the systematic destruction operation and bought precious time for the hostages. Her radio crackled with Wilson's voice filled with a mixture of anger and resignation. "Martinez, you've just turned a covert extraction into a full-scale firefight. We're coming down to support you, but this goes against every tactical principle we've ever learned." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that she wouldn't be facing 20 armed men alone, but dread at the knowledge that she had just forced her entire team into a situation that could get them all killed. "Roger that, Commander. Hostiles are taking defensive positions around the compound. Recommend approach from the west side where the explosion created the breach." Even as she spoke, Sarah was lining up her next shot. 2 men had taken position behind a low wall near the compound's entrance, and they were directing fire toward her general area. She could eliminate one, maybe both, before they pinpointed her new location. The first target was partially concealed behind the wall, but his shoulder and part of his torso were visible. Sarah adjusted for the distance and angle, then fired. The man spun and fell behind the wall. His companion immediately dove for better cover, but not before Sarah got a second shot off that caught him in the leg. Return fire came immediately, but it was less accurate now. The cleanup crew was operating under stress and confusion, which degraded their marksmanship. Sarah used this to her advantage, moving again before they could zero in on her position. From her third firing position, she could see Wilson's team descending the hillside in tactical formation. They were still several minutes away, but their presence would soon shift the balance of the engagement. The question was whether the hostages could survive that long. Through her scope, Sarah could see renewed activity around the compound's main building. Despite the explosion and ongoing firefight, some of the cleanup crew was still trying to complete their mission. She watched as 2 men entered the building through the main entrance, heading in the direction of the room where she had seen the hostages. This was the critical moment. Sarah could continue providing covering fire for Wilson's approach, or she could try to prevent the execution of the hostages. She couldn't do both effectively. She made the choice that would define her career and haunt her dreams for years to come. Abandoning her supporting fire role, Sarah began moving down the hillside toward the compound. She couldn't reach the building before the men got to the hostages, but she might be able to create enough distraction and chaos to save their lives. Sarah moved in a zigzag pattern, using rocks and sparse vegetation for cover. Return fire tracked her movement but remained inaccurate. The defenders were firing too quickly and not taking time to aim properly. As she descended, Sarah could hear the firefight intensifying. Wilson's team had engaged the outer perimeter guards, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed across the valley. The cleanup crew was now fighting a 2-front battle, which would stretch their resources and potentially create the opening needed for a successful rescue. 200 meters from the compound, Sarah took position behind a boulder large enough to provide cover from multiple directions. From here, she could see the breach in the wall created by her earlier shot. Smoke was still rising from the building, and she could see flames spreading through the ground floor. That S, when she noticed something that changed everything. Movement in the window where she had seen the hostages earlier caught her attention. One of the bound figures was no longer in the room. Either he had been moved, or he had managed to free himself during the chaos. Sarah focused her scope on the building's second floor, scanning each visible window. In a room 2 windows away from the original location, she spotted movement. 3 figures were visible, but their positions had changed. One appeared to be standing, no longer bound. The explosion and firefight had apparently given the hostages an opportunity to begin freeing themselves. If they could get out of the building and reach the breach in the wall, they might be able to escape during the confusion of the ongoing battle. Sarah keyed her radio. Commander, hostages may be attempting self-extraction. Recommend directing, covering fire toward the northeast corner to support their movement. Wilson's reply was barely audible over the sound of gunfire. Copy that. We're advancing on the main entrance now. Sarah realized she was in a unique position to assist the hostage escape attempt. From her location, she could provide precise, covering fire for their movement while Wilson's team dealt with the main body of defenders. It would require perfect timing and accurate shooting, but it was their best chance. She watched the second-floor windows and waited for the hostages to make their move. The firefight around the compound's perimeter was reaching maximum intensity, with Wilson's team methodically eliminating the outer guards while taking occasional return fire. Then she saw him. One of the hostages appeared at a second-floor window, looking down at the ground below. He appeared to be calculating whether he could survive a jump to the rocky ground 15 feet below. Sarah lined up a shot on a defender who was positioned between the building and the wall breach. If the hostage jumped, this man would have a clear shot at him. She controlled her breathing and waited for the right moment. The hostage jumped just as Sarah pulled the trigger. Her bullet found its target, and the defender dropped just as the hostage hit the ground hard but alive. 1 down, 2 to go. The remaining 2 hostages appeared at the same window. One helped the other, who appeared to be injured or weak. They would need more time and more covering fire to reach safety. Sarah began the most intense period of shooting in her career, systematically eliminating threats between the building and the wall breach, while Wilson's team pressed their assault from the opposite direction. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of Afghanistan's Helmand province. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her rifle scope and watched the enemy compound through the crosshairs. Behind her, 8 members of SEAL Team 7 waited for her signal. The mission had seemed straightforward when they received the briefing 12 hours ago. Intelligence reported that 2 high-value targets were meeting in the compound below. General Rashid Khan and General Mahmoud Aziz, both key leaders in the terrorist network that had been terrorizing the region for months. Sarah had been with the team for 3 years, but this was her first mission as the designated marksman. Other SEALs had initially questioned having a woman in their unit, but her performance during training had silenced most doubters. She could shoot better than half the men and had a tactical mind that impressed even the most seasoned veterans. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by steep hills. It looked quiet from their position, almost too quiet. Sarah felt something wasn't right, but she couldn't pinpoint what bothered her. The intelligence had been solid, coming from a trusted source who had provided accurate information before. 2 generals, minimal security, quick extraction. It should have been a textbook operation. Team leader Commander Jake Wilson crawled up beside her. His weathered face showed concern as he studied the target area through his binoculars. Wilson had led dozens of missions like this, but something about today felt different. The lack of movement around the compound was unusual. Even terrorist hideouts typically showed signs of life during daylight hours. "What do you think, Martinez?" Wilson whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah continued scanning the area through her scope. "Something's off, Commander. No guards, visible, no movement in the windows. Either they're being very careful or this is a setup." Wilson nodded slowly. He had learned to trust his team's instincts, especially Sarah's. Her attention to detail had saved them from walking into ambushes before. But the mission parameters were clear. Washington wanted these generals captured or eliminated, and the window of opportunity was closing fast. The rest of the team maintained their positions along the ridgeline. Sergeant Mike Thompson checked his assault rifle for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Next to him, Corpsman David Lee organized his medical supplies, preparing for potential casualties. The newest team member, Petty Officer First Class James Rodriguez, tried to calm his nerves by focusing on his breathing techniques. Radio chatter crackled in Sarah's earpiece. Overwatch, this is Command. Status report. Wilson keyed his microphone. Command Overwatch, target area appears quiet. No visual confirmation of HVTs yet. Copy that, Overwatch. Proceed with mission as planned. Time is critical. Sarah frowned. The urgency in the command center's voice suggested they knew something. The team didn't. She had seen this before in previous missions. Sometimes headquarters received intelligence updates they didn't share with ground teams until after the operation began. The plan was simple in theory. Sarah would provide overwatch while the team moved down the hillside in 2 groups. Wilson would lead 4 men to the main entrance while Sergeant Thompson took the remaining 3 to secure the back exit. Once they confirmed the presence of the 2 generals, they would either capture them for interrogation or eliminate them if capture proved impossible. As the team prepared to move, Sarah noticed movement in one of the compound's windows. A figure appeared briefly before disappearing again. Through her scope, she couldn't make out details, but the person's movements seemed deliberate, not random. Commander, I have movement in the northeast window, 2nd floor, she reported quietly. Wilson adjusted his position to get a better view. Can you identify? Negative. Too brief and too far for positive identification. The team began their descent, moving in practiced formation. Sarah tracked their progress through her scope while simultaneously scanning the compound for threats. The silence was unnerving. Most enemy positions would have sentries or at least someone monitoring the approaches. Halfway down the hillside, Wilson raised his fist, signaling a halt. Something had caught his attention. Sarah followed his gaze through her scope and saw what had stopped him. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt led away from the compound. The tracks looked recent, possibly made within the last few hours. Command Overwatch, we have fresh vehicle tracks leading from the target area. Recommend caution proceeding. Overwatch Command, intelligence indicates targets are still in position. Continue with mission. Wilson's jaw tightened. He didn't like being pushed forward when evidence suggested the situation had changed. But orders were orders, and the team had a job to do. Sarah continued her surveillance as the team resumed movement. The compound's main building was larger than it had appeared from the ridge. Multiple rooms and corridors would make clearing the structure challenging. If the generals were actually inside, they could be anywhere within the maze-like layout. The first team reached the main entrance without incident. Wilson positioned his men while waiting for Thompson's team to secure the rear exit. Radio silence was crucial now. Any communication could alert potential enemies to their presence. Through her scope, Sarah watched Thompson's team approach the back of the compound. They moved like shadows, years of training evident in every step. Just as they reached the rear wall, Sarah caught movement in her peripheral vision. 3 vehicles were approaching the compound from the east, kicking up dust clouds in their wake. The vehicles were still several hundred meters away, but they were moving fast and heading directly toward the target building. Commander, 3 vehicles approaching from the east. ETA approximately 2 minutes, Sarah whispered into her microphone. Wilson, S, voice came back tense. Can you identify occupants or intent? Sarah adjusted her scope's magnification and focused on the lead vehicle. Through the dust and distance, she could make out armed figures in the back of what appeared to be a military-style truck. The second and third vehicles looked similar. Multiple armed personnel visible. Estimate 15 to 20 individuals total. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as a surgical strike against 2 high-value targets was becoming a potential firefight against superior numbers in hostile territory. Wilson had to make a decision quickly. The vehicles were now less than a minute away from the compound. If the team proceeded with the original plan, they would be caught between potential enemies inside the building and definite enemies arriving outside. If they retreated now, they would lose the opportunity to capture or eliminate the generals. Wilson, his voice crackled over the radio with the decision that would change everything. All units, prepare for extraction. We're pulling back. Sarah's finger hovered over the trigger as she lined up her first shot. The guard by the lead vehicle was smoking a cigarette, completely unaware that death was looking at him through a high-powered scope. 400 meters away, he represented the first domino in a chain reaction that could either save the mission or end Sarah's life. Her radio crackled with Wilson's increasingly urgent voice. "Martinez, this is a direct order. Fall back to extract point immediately." Sarah switched off her radio. She couldn't afford the distraction, and she knew Wilson would spend precious minutes trying to talk her out of what she was about to do. This decision was hers alone, and she had already committed to the course of action. The first target took a long drag from his cigarette and turned slightly, giving Sarah a perfect profile shot. She controlled her breathing, letting half the air out of her lungs before holding steady. The crosshairs settled on the center of his chest. The rifle bucked against her shoulder as the first round left the barrel. Through her scope, she watched the target drop instantly. Before his body hit the ground, she was already transitioning to the second guard, who was standing near the middle vehicle. The second target hadn't yet realized what had happened to his companion. He was checking something on his rifle when Sarah's second bullet found him. The suppressed rifle made little noise, and the distance prevented the sound from carrying to the compound. The third guard was the most alert of the three. He had been scanning the surrounding hills with binoculars, and Sarah could see him starting to react to his fallen comrades. She had maybe 3 seconds before he could alert the others, or find cover. This shot was slightly more challenging. The target was moving, turning toward the compound while reaching for his radio. Sarah led him slightly and squeezed the trigger just as he raised the radio to his mouth. 3 shots, 3 targets down. The vehicles were now unguarded, and the cleanup crew inside the compound was unaware that their escape route had been eliminated. Sarah had bought herself time, but she knew the clock was still ticking. She quickly reloaded and began scanning the compound for her next targets. The men inside were still working on placing explosive charges, but their work was nearly complete. Sarah estimated she had maybe 10 minutes before they finished and attempted to leave. That quote as when she noticed something that changed everything. Through a window on the second floor of the main building, she caught a glimpse of someone who definitely wasn't part of the cleanup crew. The figure was bound and appeared to be struggling against restraints. Sarah adjusted her scope's magnification and focused on the window. What she saw made her heart race. It wasn't one person. There were at least 3 individuals tied up in that room. The cleanup crew wasn't just destroying evidence. They were preparing to eliminate witnesses. The mission parameters had just shifted, dramatically. This was no longer about gathering intelligence or tracking escaped generals. There were hostages in that compound, and they were about to be executed. Sarah keyed her radio back on. "Commander, I have visual on hostages inside the compound. 3 individuals bound second floor northeast room." Wilson's voice came back immediately, filled with concern and anger. "Martinez, where are you? We're at the extract point waiting." "For you." "Commander, there are hostages about to be executed. I've neutralized the vehicle guards, but the cleanup crew is preparing to finish their mission and eliminate witnesses." The radio was quiet for several long seconds. Sarah could imagine the heated discussion taking place among the team members 400 meters up the hillside. Leaving hostages to die went against everything they had trained for, but mounting a rescue operation against superior numbers in hostile territory was tactically unsound. Finally, Wilson's voice crackled through the radio. "Martinez, can you confirm the identity of the hostages?" Sarah focused her scope on the window again. One of the bound figures had managed to turn toward the window, and she could see his face clearly. Middle-aged, bearded, wearing what looked like traditional Afghan clothing. Not American, but potentially a valuable intelligence source. Negative on American hostages, but potentially high-value intelligence sources. Afghan nationals, possibly interpreters or informants. The radio went quiet again. Sarah knew Wilson was weighing impossible choices. Abandon the hostages and complete the extraction, or risk the entire team to save 3 unknown individuals who might or might not be valuable to ongoing operations. While waiting for Wilson's decision, Sarah continued her surveillance of the compound. The cleanup crew was working systematically, but they had made another tactical error. Most of their personnel were inside the building, leaving only a few guards outside. If Wilson decided to attempt a rescue, they would have tactical advantages. Despite being outnumbered, Dot movement caught her eye near the compound's main entrance. Two men were carrying what looked like additional explosive charges. They weren't just planning to destroy evidence, they were preparing to level the entire building with the hostages inside. Sarah made a decision that would haunt military strategists for years to come. She couldn't wait for orders that might never come or might come too late to matter. 3 people were about to die, and she was the only person in position to prevent it. She targeted the man carrying the largest explosive device. At this range, she could potentially detonate the charges he was carrying, creating chaos and confusion that might give the hostages a chance to escape, or at least buy Wilson's team time to mount a rescue operation. The shot would reveal her position and bring the entire cleanup crew's attention to her location on the hillside. She would become the primary target for 20 armed men, with limited ammunition and no immediate backup. It was potentially a suicide mission. But as Sarah watched, through her scope, she saw one of the hostages in the window looking directly at her position. He couldn't possibly see her at this distance, but something about his posture suggested he knew someone was watching. He was counting on someone to help. Sarah lined up her shot on the man with the explosives. The target was moving, but predictably, following the same path his teammates had taken. She calculated the lead time and began her breathing sequence. "Commander, I'm taking the shot, moving to assist hostages. You can court-martial me later if we all survive this." She pulled the trigger just as Wilson's voice exploded over the radio. "Martinez, do not engage. That is a direct order." But the bullet was already flying toward its target, and Sarah Martinez was already moving to her next firing position as the compound below erupted in chaos. Sarah watched through her scope as the team began their tactical withdrawal. The approaching vehicles had forced Wilson's hand, but something deep in her gut told her they were making a mistake. The mission intelligence had been too specific, too detailed to be completely wrong. 2 generals don't just disappear without a trace, especially when multiple intelligence sources had confirmed their presence. The lead vehicle was now close enough for Sarah to see individual faces. Armed men in military fatigues filled the truck bed, their weapons ready for action. But as she studied them more carefully, something struck her as odd. These men weren't moving with the urgency of reinforcements rushing to defend a position. They looked relaxed, almost casual. "Commander holding position for better assessment," Sarah radioed, ignoring the extraction order. Wilson's voice came back sharp. "Martinez, fall back now. That's an order." But Sarah had noticed something that changed everything. The men in the approaching vehicles were wearing a mix of uniforms and equipment that didn't match standard terrorist organization patterns. Some wore Afghan military patches, others had equipment that looked American-made. This wasn't a terrorist reinforcement convoy. This was something else entirely. Through her scope, she could see Wilson's team moving back up the hillside in tactical formation. Thompson's team was also pulling back from the rear of the compound. In 30 seconds, they would be beyond the effective range where she could provide cover if something went wrong. The vehicles reached the compound and stopped. Sarah counted exactly 23 men as they dismounted and began moving toward the building. But instead of taking defensive positions or rushing inside to help defend against an attack, they moved with the systematic precision of men conducting a search operation. When Sarah realized the truth. This wasn't an enemy reinforcement. This was a cleanup crew. Her mind raced through the implications. If these were cleanup crews, it meant someone had warned the generals about the SEAL team's mission. The targets had already been evacuated, and these men were here to sanitize the compound before American forces could gather intelligence from it. Sarah keyed her radio again. "Commander, those vehicles aren't reinforcements. I think we're looking at a cleanup operation. The targets may have already been moved." Wilson's response was immediate. "Martinez, I don't care what they are. We have 20+ hostiles and orders to extract. Move now." But Sarah was already calculating angles and distances. If this was indeed a cleanup crew, there might still be valuable intelligence inside that compound. Documents, communication equipment, computer files, anything that could help track down where the generals had been relocated. The mission could still be salvaged. She watched the cleanup crew through her scope as they began systematically entering the compound. Their movements confirmed her suspicions. These weren't defenders. They were professionals conducting a deliberate evidence removal operation. Commander, request permission to remain in overwatch position. These men are destroying evidence. We might be losing our only chance to track the targets. Wilson's voice crackled with frustration. Negative, Martinez. Extract immediately. We'll call in air support if needed. Air support would level the compound, and everything in it. Any intelligence value would be lost in the bombardment. Sarah knew that sometimes in the field, soldiers had to make decisions that went against orders to serve the greater mission objective. This felt like one of those moments. She watched Wilson's team continue their withdrawal while keeping her scope trained on the compound. The cleanup crew had divided into teams, with some men entering the main building while others took positions around the perimeter. Their efficiency was impressive and troubling. Then Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. One of the men near the compound's entrance was placing what looked like explosive charges. They weren't just cleaning up evidence, they were preparing to destroy the entire site. Commander, they're rigging the compound with explosives. If we let them finish, we lose everything. Wilson's team had reached a position roughly 300 meters up the hillside. They were still within Sarah's protective range, but barely. In another few minutes, they would be too far away for her to provide effective cover fire if needed. The radio crackled with Wilson's voice, and for the first time, he sounded uncertain. Say again, Martinez. Explosives? Confirmed. They're placing charges around the main building. Estimated 5 minutes before they complete the setup. Sarah could hear Wilson discussing options with his team members over an open channel. The conversation was brief, but heated. Some team members wanted to proceed with the extraction. Others were suggesting they had a duty to prevent the destruction of potential intelligence. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her surveillance of the compound. The cleanup crew was working with military precision, but they had made one critical mistake. They had positioned most of their security around the main building while leaving their vehicles lightly guarded. 3 men remained near the vehicles while the rest worked on the compound. If someone could neutralize the vehicle guards quietly, it would strand the cleanup crew and potentially force them to abandon their mission. Sarah estimated the distance to the vehicles at approximately 400 meters. Well within her effective range with the specialized rifle she carried. The question was whether she could take out 3 targets quickly enough to prevent them from alerting the others. She had trained for scenarios like this countless times. Multiple target engagement required precise timing and perfect shot placement. Miss one target or take too long between shots and the entire mission would be compromised. Commander, I have a solution. 3 guards at vehicles, 400 meters. I can neutralize them and strand the cleanup crew. Wilson's response was immediate. Absolutely not, Martinez. You're one shooter against 20-plus hostiles. Even if you take out the guards, the rest will hunt you down. But Sarah was already adjusting her scope and calculating wind speed. The morning air was calm, with only a light breeze from the west. Conditions were nearly perfect for long-range shooting. She had made harder shots during training exercises. The cleanup crew continued their work, unaware that they were being watched by a single SEAL sniper who was considering action that could change the entire dynamic of the mission. Sarah took a deep breath and made her decision. Sometimes saving a mission required taking risks that went beyond standard operating procedures. The intelligence in that compound could lead them to the generals and potentially save countless lives in future operations. She chambered around and settled into her shooting position, ignoring the increasingly urgent extraction orders crackling through her radio earpiece. The first target was in her crosshairs. Sarah's rifle fired in rapid succession as she provided covering fire for the escaping hostages. Each shot was calculated and precise, eliminating defenders who posed immediate threats to the 3 men trying to reach safety. Her position behind the boulder gave her a clear view of the entire compound, allowing her to see threats that Wilson's team couldn't detect from their approach angle. The second hostage jumped from the window, landing awkwardly but managing to stay on his feet. He immediately helped his companion, who had been injured in the fall and was struggling to move toward the breach in the wall. The third hostage remained at the window, apparently preparing to jump but hesitating due to fear or injury. Sarah identified 2 more defenders who were repositioning to get clear shots at the escaping hostages. She eliminated the first with a headshot at 300 meters, then quickly transitioned to the second target, who was taking cover behind a pile of construction materials near the breach. Her radio crackled with Wilson's voice. "Martinez, we're encountering heavy resistance at the main entrance. They've got at least 10 men concentrated in defensive positions around the front of the building." Sarah could see the problem Wilson was describing. The cleanup crew had regrouped after the initial chaos and established overlapping fields of fire that were preventing the SEAL team from advancing. Without direct support, Wilson's team was pinned down in positions that offered limited cover. "Commander, I can see your problem from here. You've got 3 defenders on the roof with high ground advantage plus the ground-level positions. I can eliminate the roof threat." Sarah adjusted her scope's elevation and focused on the building's rooftop. 3 men had taken positions behind a low parapet, giving them excellent views of Wilson's approach route. They were the primary threat preventing the team's advance. The first rooftop target was partially concealed, but Sarah could see enough of his torso to make an accurate shot. The bullet struck center mass and the man dropped behind the parapet. His 2 companions immediately began searching for the source of the shot, giving Sarah the opportunity she needed. The second rooftop defender made the mistake of exposing too much of himself while trying to locate Sarah's position. Her bullet caught him in the upper chest, spinning him around before he collapsed. The third defender wisely retreated to better cover, but his firing position was now compromised. With the rooftop threat neutralized, Wilson's team began advancing again. Sarah could see them moving in coordinated bounds, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance to the main building. Their progress was steady but cautious. Meanwhile, the third hostage had finally jumped from the window. He landed hard and remained motionless for several seconds before slowly getting to his feet. All 3 hostages were now on the ground, but they still needed to cover approximately 50 meters to reach the safety of the wall breach. Sarah turned her attention back to protecting the hostages' escape route. 2 more defenders had appeared near the breach, apparently intending to prevent the hostages from reaching safety. She eliminated both with rapid, accurate fire that left the escape route clear. The hostages began moving toward the breach, with the 2 less injured men supporting their wounded companion. Their progress was slow but steady. Sarah continued scanning for threats while monitoring Wilson's team's advance on the opposite side of the compound. That quote essay, when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Smoke was no longer just rising. From the ground floor of the building, new fires had started on the upper floors and they were spreading rapidly. The building was becoming an inferno, and there might be additional people trapped inside. Sarah keyed her radio. "Commander, the building is fully engulfed now. We need to ensure there are no additional hostages or intelligence assets still inside." Wilson's response was grim. "Martinez, we're still taking fire from inside the building. There are at least 6 defenders remaining, and they're fighting from prepared positions. We can't conduct a building search under these conditions." Sarah realized the terrible truth. If there were additional hostages or valuable intelligence inside that building, they were going to be lost. The fire was spreading too quickly, and the remaining defenders were preventing any rescue attempts. But then she remembered something from her initial surveillance: the fresh tire tracks leading away from the compound. What if the most valuable intelligence had already been moved, but some documents or equipment had been left behind in the rush to evacuate? "Commander, recommend we focus on securing the current hostages and any intelligence they might have. The building is lost, but these 3 men might have critical information." The hostages had reached the wall breach and were taking cover behind the rubble. Sarah could see that one of them was in serious condition, possibly from injuries sustained before the firefight began. They would need immediate medical attention. Wilson's team had reached the main building and was engaging the remaining defenders in close quarters combat. The sound of gunfire inside the structure was intense but brief. suggesting the SEAL team's superior training and equipment were overwhelming the defenders. Sarah maintained her overwatch position, ready to provide covering fire if any threats emerged from unexpected directions. The compound was largely secured, but she knew from experience that desperate enemies could still pose significant dangers. Her radio crackled with Wilson's voice. "Building is clear. We have 6 enemy KIA and significant fire damage throughout. No additional hostages found, but we're recovering what documents and equipment we can before the structure becomes unsafe." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The firefight was winding down, but the mission's success would ultimately be determined by what intelligence they could gather from the rescued hostages and any materials recovered from the burning. Building. She began moving toward the compound to link up with Wilson's team and assist with the hostage evacuation. As she descended the hillside, Sarah reflected on the decisions she had made during the engagement. She had violated direct orders, initiated a firefight against superior numbers, and risked the lives of her entire team. But 3 hostages were alive who would have been executed, and the cleanup crew's mission had been completely disrupted. Whatever intelligence they had been trying to destroy might still be recoverable from the rescued hostages or the partially destroyed building. Sarah reached the compound perimeter, just as Wilson emerged from the burning building carrying a waterproof case that had survived the fire. His face was grim but determined as he approached her position. "Martinez, we need to talk about what happened here today. But first, let's get these hostages medical attention and see what intelligence we can gather." The helicopter extraction arrived 30 minutes after the firefight ended. Sarah watched as the medical corpsman worked on the most seriously injured hostage, while Wilson coordinated with the pilot and reviewed the intelligence materials they had recovered. The waterproof case contained documents that would prove more valuable than anyone initially realized. During the flight back to base, Sarah learned the identity of the 3 men they had rescued. The most seriously injured was Colonel Ahmad Nasser, a former Afghan military officer who had been feeding intelligence to American forces for over 2 years. The other 2 were his contacts within the terrorist network, double agents who had provided the original intelligence about the meeting. Between the 2 generals. The documents in the waterproof case revealed the scope of the operation Sarah had disrupted. The 2 generals hadn't just been meeting to plan future attacks. They had been coordinating the systematic elimination of every intelligence asset working with American forces in the region. The rescued hostages represented only the first targets, in a campaign that would have destroyed years of carefully built intelligence networks. Wilson sat across from Sarah during the flight, his expression unreadable. She knew she would face consequences for her actions, but the full scope of those consequences wouldn't be clear until they returned to base and filed their reports. "Martinez," Wilson said quietly, speaking over the helicopter's noise. "What you did today saved 3 lives and potentially prevented the collapse of our entire intelligence.